Hi everyone, Dr. Hinkey here, and on to our final chapter in Unit 1. So be all ready for the test. This is a really fascinating chapter on conservation of biodiversity, what biodiversity is, why it's important, why we want to conserve it. And while it brings together a whole lot, the reason this is at the end of our textbook is because it does bring together so many of the things that we'll be learning about in the weeks ahead. We just decided to put this first because it's a lot more interesting than starting out talking about chemistry. But this should give you a good idea of why it's important that we do talk about chemistry. Because as some of you have noted in discussion, it's all related, and all of biology is chemistry and physics. So on to conservation of biodiversity. Here are our Chapter 47 learning objectives. You'll see there are only 4 of them. We're going to define conservation biology, describe biodiversity, and how that relates to the 3 levels of biological organizations. We'll look at genetic diversity, community diversity, landscape diversity, and then what that means in terms of biodiversity hotspots. We'll compare the direct and indirect values of biodiversity. And then we'll look a little bit at extinction and the different causes, things that contribute, the main contributors to extinction. So our outline of the chapter is pretty much what we just talked about: conservation biology, values of biodiversity, causes of extinction. We will not get into 47.4 specific conservation techniques, but that is a very interesting part of the chapter. For those of you who this has piqued your interest, you might want to look at some of the methods that are used to conserve biology and some of the issues and challenges to that. All right, so we have a great example of an invasive species, one of the big threats to biodiversity locally. That's the impact of the lionfish, Pterois volitans and Pterois miles. These are both top predators in their natural environment. That is their role. They are the apex predators. They make sure that grazers, that there's balance. So remember, we needed all the species in our community to maintain that balance. But species have adapted to their habitat, and those communities have adapted all the different species one to each other. So when they are together with the species they have evolved to work with, they do a great job. When we take one of those from one habitat or ecosystem and put it into another, it disrupts the communities, it disrupts biodiversity, because even though there's still a need for that same role, they will be in direct competition with others that have that same niche. And if you remember, 2 species can't occupy the same niche. The one that's better able to utilize the resources will win. And that can cause some domino effects in environments. In the case of lionfish, what happened here in the southeast is they are Pacific species and Indian Ocean species. They're beautiful coloration. Of course, they are excellent aquarium fish. Look at them. If you've been to the aquarium in Charleston, they are just spectacular. They're very beautiful as they float around. But they are voracious predators. They are just eating machines. And because of their poison spines, there is nothing here in the Atlantic or in the Caribbean that has adapted, that has evolved with them to be a predator. There's nothing that has defenses or a way around those toxic spines, so nothing eats them while they go ahead and eat and eat and eat. Over 50 types of fish. So they're a bit of a problem because they are eating up all of the other fish. So they're eating the fish that are food for higher up the food chain, starving them out. They're eating predators of lower down the food chain, and that lets algae start to overgrowth. As we lose grazers, algae can overgrow the coral reefs. So the introduction of these lionfish has led to a reduction in biodiversity everywhere because they are removing key components in those food webs. So that's just one example. We'll talk a little bit more about invasive species, but that just sort of sets the tone for why this is important. So conservation biology is the study of all the different aspects of biodiversity, and its goal or its intent is to understand biodiversity in the context of ecosystem, environmental, and human health, so that we can protect that, so we can manage these ecosystems in a way that maintains biodiversity or the variety of life on Earth, so that we can have and use these natural resources for this and future generations. So when we talk about natural resource management and managing resources, the truth is we don't really need to manage the resources. We need to manage human uses of the resources in order to maintain that biodiversity, since, as we'll see, we are the ones impacting it. If we left these resources to their own devices, they'd all balance out and work wonderfully. So for our efforts to be effective in conservation biology, we can't just look at a single species. We can't look at one incident or one act. We have to look at it more holistically. And we have to look at all those connections that you've mentioned in your posts, how it is all connected. So we want to look at the past, what's been done in the past, what's caused past extinctions, how those could have been avoided, where they could be avoided. Extinction is a natural process. There is a natural background level. It's how evolution happens, survival of the fittest for their habitat. So there is always this background level of that. But how do we keep from exacerbating it and being the driving force of extinction so that we don't decrease our biodiversity and therefore decrease our ecosystem health, which comes back and decreases human health. So the reason we want a high level of biodiversity, a lot of variety of life on Earth, is because that's what keeps us healthy. We've got a bunch of tools that help with conservation biology. We'll talk about bioinformatics in just a minute, but that's collecting and using data and creating computer models to show what could happen, what will happen. If we understand how the ecosystems are working, we can create models in order to predict what will happen based on different scenarios. So increased biodiversity, the reason we want to increase our biodiversity is because it keeps the whole ecosystem healthy, and we are part of that ecosystem. We draw these and never include humans in here, but we are part of this. We're dependent on healthy food webs. And if we see just one path of energy, a food chain, not a lot of diversity, any decrease will pretty much result in the destruction of this. If we remove the grasshopper, the mouse is going to die, the owl's going to die, the grass is going to overgrow everything. If we remove the owl, the mice are going to go crazy, their population is going to grow, they'll eat up all the grasshoppers, which will keep plants and weeds, keeps their population in control. So all of these balance each other. So the more biodiversity we have, the more complex these food pathways and energy pathways become. And that helps to maintain ecosystem health and our health. If one of these species is removed, there's something else keeping the others in check in every direction. So biodiversity helps to keep ecosystems functioning smoothly. So conservation biology is pretty complex. There's a whole lot to understand. We need to understand Systemics, how does the whole system work? Ecology, how are these things working? Field biology, so seeing what's going on out in the field. Evolutionary biology, behavioral biology, physiology, fisheries biology, management, veterinary science, all of these different components. So there's a lot that contributes. Conservation biologists tend to be a jack of all trades. They know a little bit about all of these things, don't focus necessarily on any one, but have background and experience and knowledge in all of these and work with professionals in all of these fields. As we said, all of these are going to generate data, lots and lots of data. So bioinformatics, anybody who's interested in computers and computer gaming, in computer programming, in data, this is a huge area in all fields of science right now. And now there's a big push. You hear a lot of discussion about we need people who are able to manage big data, and people in scientific fields, especially in oceanography. My background laugh about this because now this is the big push. Everybody wants to be an expert on big data, or what we in oceanography call data. Because we work with huge data sets all the time. But for any of those of you who are interested in computer fields and think, oh, why should I care about biology? Computer modeling, data management, processing, huge contributors and partners in biology. So understanding biology and entering a computer field, that is the gold standard right now. All right, so our biodiversity, if we look at endangered and threatened species, those are the things that are threatening biodiversity. When we're talking about biodiversity, we're really looking at all the species on Earth, the variety. We don't know. We have not discovered all the species on Earth. We like to think we have, but every year we find dozens more species, things that we don't know. And at the same time, we are rapidly losing species. We can categorize those species as endangered. They're in peril of immediate extinction, almost everywhere in their range, or threatened. And those are the ones that are not yet endangered, but if we don't do something to protect them, they are likely to become endangered. When we look at biodiversity, we can look at 3 different levels of organization. And remember we talked about atoms form molecules, molecules form our organelles that form our cells form tissue, and on up. We have these levels of organization where we can look at biodiversity on different scales. On the genetic level, we're looking at molecules. We're looking at the genetic diversity, the DNA. What is the, how many variations, how different are individuals within the same population? And we understand that just looking around, people look different. Those physical differences are based in genetic diversity, in different genes. So within any population, how much diversity is there on the molecular level? And then community diversity, we're looking at how many different species are present in the community. What's the species richness? And that distribution, how are they distributed within the community? And then we're looking at landscape diversity, which looks at the landscape interactions, the habitats. We're looking at interactions of, for example, mountains through the rivers to the grasslands. How are they connected? What are their interactions? How does one depend on the other? Because they really aren't separate. We talk about an ecosystem or a habitat where a group of organisms, a community lives, but it connects to the one. There's not a border between them. They connect, they interact, they exchange parts. So I already said this. Genetic diversity is the variations within the population, the molecular level. Community diversity, we're at the individual level, their interactions, but of communities, of all the different populations within an area. and then landscape diversity, how the landscape interacts. And if we disrupt any part of these, we have this whole trickle-down effect. Looking at community diversity and how any one population within that community, how any change to that balance in the community can have a big impact that sort of dominoes and triggers everything. This example is in your textbook on page 899. And it looks at this, oops, where'd we go? At our community of bear, eagle, and salmon. So this would be in the Pacific Northwest. And the spawning salmon, you've all seen those great National Geographic pictures, commercials of the grizzly bears coming out and scooping the salmon out of the river as they return to spawn. The eagles eat the salmon. And in a misguided attempt to help that ecosystem for fishermen to have more fish, they introduced possum shrimp. And they put those in as prey, a food source for salmon. Say, gee, if we put more food in for the salmon to eat, we'll have more salmon, won't we? But when we don't really know how these are going to act or what these are going to do, yes, salmon will eat them. But in the meantime, these are going to be eating other things. And the salmon actually started competing against these shrimp that were introduced. The shrimp were eating up all of the plankton that the salmon also used as a food source. So they were part of the plankton, but they're also predators in that plankton. And they outcompeted the salmon. They were just better at getting that food source. They depleted the salmon's food source. The trickle down, the domino effect was that now the bear and the eagle food source of the salmon was also gone or declining, and so their populations subsequently declined. So these ecosystems and the communities that live in them have all evolved together, and we start to disrupt them, and we have some long-term unknown consequences. And we have examples throughout human history of us doing this. So when we look at biodiversity, at our genetic diversity, community diversity, and landscape diversity, those different components of biodiversity aren't evenly distributed everywhere on the planet. There are some areas that are much more endowed with biodiversity. We refer to these as biodiversity hotspots. And they, in only about 1.4% of the Earth's land area, so very, very small percentage, 1.4% of all the land on Earth contains about 44% of the known higher plant species and 35% of the terrestrial vertebrate species. So examples of this are Madagascar, the rainforests, tropical rainforests. They tend to be primarily in tropical regions. The coast of California. So just very specific areas, coral reefs, have lots and lots and lots of biodiversity. So a very small percentage of the planet contains most of the known species on the planet. So it's important to protect those habitats, those landscapes, and the whole ecosystem. And why do we care? Well, biodiversity is really, really valuable. And that's both directly, we have direct financial value and gain from this, and indirectly with ecosystem services that we can put a price tag on. We don't, we take advantage of them, but we can calculate what that indirect value is. So for direct values, we're looking at things, services that we get from biodiversity, from those communities and ecosystems that humans derive economic benefit. These are medicinal value, agricultural value, and consumptive use value. That's when we use that resource directly as a market, as part of a market to buy and sell. So medicinal value, most prescription drugs are derived from living organisms. Aspirin, originally derived from willow tree bark. We can now make the same compound that's been isolated, can make that synthetically, make man-made versions, but originally came from living organism. Penicillin originally came from fungus, from mold, and derived that. Now we can make synthetic versions, but we do still harvest it. The rosy periwinkle, somebody mentioned in their discussion post, I think it was Clarence, that we get chemicals, we get medicines that are used to treat leukemia and Hodgkin's disease from the rosy periwinkle. You've all seen those out in the environment. They're fairly common. So really important drugs that we derive from these. And who knows what else is out there. So a really, really big area of research in marine science is finding extracts in algae and in coral reef, in different corals that are possibly, they've shown potential for use as in chemotherapy, as cancer drugs, and for treatment of cancer. So we have lots and lots of areas that we're still looking at, and at the same time we're destroying habitats and losing these species at a rapid rate. So hopefully we don't lose them before we find how they can help us. So we want to make sure we manage these to ensure their continued survival so that we don't lose species before we know what value they could possibly have to us for human health. Our agricultural value, clearly in agriculture, wheat, corn, rice, these were all derived from wild plants. They were modified over time to increase their yield. That's through agriculture, through selective breeding practices. We developed the species that we use as our primary food sources. So natural predators of plants, of plant pests, have been introduced in agricultural systems because we want to reduce the impact of pests on plant yields. One of the things that we are learning the hard way is that the synthetic pesticides that we've used traditionally to control predators have long-term consequences. Those are persistent organic pollutants. They're known mutagens, carcinogens, and they bioaccumulate. And if we're spraying those all over the food we eat, one of the species they'll bioaccumulate to is us. So we're looking more at integrated ways to control pests, to protect agriculture, ways that aren't going to end up poisoning us. So biodiversity for agriculture has direct value to humans, obviously, and a loss of biodiversity is a big threat to food security for human populations. One of those losses of biodiversity that's human-driven is that through agriculture we have selected and promulgated 4 main species to meet all of the major food needs of humans. So there used to be millions of species. When you go to places like South America and the Caribbean, you see all sorts of what are called ground provisions. And in Africa, where they eat lots of different gourds, they have different seeds. Now we're seeing those in health food stores, things like quinoa. Look at this new and fascinating food option. But really, over the past 100 years, we've essentially lost all of those extra or different food sources to focus on growing wheat, corn, rice, and soybean. So a real big concern right now, something that even the military focuses on, because food security threatens national security. If we lose food security, there's more likely to be riots and other civil unrest in the world. So they keep an eye on this globally. But if we get most of our food needs met by 4 main crops, any threat to one of those loses 25% of the world's food source. So now there's a big push to protect biological diversity in fields of agriculture, to expand, to have options. We have seed banks that are collecting seeds from all sorts of different types of wheats other than the ones that the 4 main plants that we rely on, in order to ensure that should anything happen to one of these, we've got options. So biodiversity gives us options in all these fields, but in agriculture, it's particularly important right now. So within agriculture, we also have the value of not just the plants that we grow, but biodiversity adds value to that through things like pollinators. So natural pest control means are ladybugs. They like to eat aphids and other agricultural pests. But bats and bees, pollinators, contribute $10 to $15 billion worth of agricultural services by fertilizing things like, pollinating rather, things like apples, avocados, almonds, all these food sources that are really important in our economy get pollinated by bats and bees. So we want to protect those, to protect biodiversity of not only animals, but our plant biodiversity. We have direct value through consumptive uses, meaning these are the things that we trade, we eat, we make products from, we buy, we sell, we consume them. So freshwater fish, seafood, we sell and eat those. Consumptive use, just think, what do you consume? We also have indirect value from biodiversity. These are ecosystem services, things that we can engineer our way through a lot of these, but it becomes very, very, very costly and can be cost prohibitive in most places. So some of these indirect values are biogeochemical cycles, waste recycling, fresh water, provision of fresh water, prevention of soil erosion, climate regulation, and ecotourism. So our biogeochemical cycles, we are going to get to our chemistry unit and look a little bit more closely at these. But this is how we maintain all of the elements in the world. So the law of conservation of mass tells us that we never get new elements. It's on the periodic table of the elements on the planet. That's what we have, and they just continuously get recycled. Similarly, water gets recycled through the hydrological cycle, water, carbon, nitrogen. And wastes get recycled this way. So decomposers break down dead or dying organic matter. Fungus break down. If we didn't have fungus and bacteria that broke down trees and plants and leaf fall, we would be up to our eyeballs in leaves and in waste products. So wastewater treatment, the way your septic system works, uses the environment, uses bacteria, decomposers to break down the organic waste that you flush down the toilet, and it breaks it down to its elemental parts. And the bacteria break those down, use those for food, and release clean water and nutrients. It does that through biogeochemical cycling. So we recycle nutrients throughout the environment. Nitrogen, we have nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle, sulfur cycle, to make sure when a plant, animal, when anything dies, all of its biomass gets broken back down into these nutrients, released back to the soil for plants to incorporate into plant biomass, for animals to eat, and continue the cycle all over again. Same with the water cycle. We continuously renew that, and by evaporation even from the oceans, we can get fresh water again because the salt doesn't evaporate, only the water. And then it rains down, we get fresh water sources and continue to cycle that. And the carbon cycle. So photosynthesis captures carbon dioxide, turns it into biomass. Plants eat that, turn it into more. Animals eat the plants, turn it into biomass through cell respiration. They release carbon dioxide. We have all these other releases of carbon dioxide. As organisms die and decay, they release carbon dioxide. And as we burn fossil fuels, we release carbon dioxide. That photosynthesis absorbs to increase plant matter. So we want to make sure we have those plants to do that. But really, so what? I didn't see a single person in those pictures. Well, when we talk about recycling, we're looking at carbon and carbohydrates. We're looking at lipids, carbohydrates, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, proteins in all of those organisms to make biomass, to break down when organisms die. Proteins are made of carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, sulfur, and nucleic acids, our DNA. Those have to be released back into the environment. You see that's carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. So those elements are just continuously recycled in those cycles that I just showed. You'll see I mentioned the other day, and we'll talk about this again when we get into our organic molecules in our chemistry unit. If I reorder these letters, I can get CHNOPS, schnapps. Those are the components of a cell: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids make all the components of cells, and cells make all the components of us. So we're made of schnapps. But recycling those components is what allows us to have food and to eat and grow. So some other indirect values: providing fresh water through the hydrologic cycle, protect soil and clean water through erosion control. So plants, vegetation prevent runoff that carries soil and toxic chemicals and pollutants when it rains from running right into the water and polluting the water, sediment from clouding up the water. So erosion control that protects clean water. Regulation of climate through that carbon cycle, regulation of temperature through trees, forests. If anybody doubts the impact that trees can have on temperatures, when it's really, really hot and humid here in Charleston in the middle of the day, head over to Charlestown Landing and walk down their drive. It's about a mile long, but it's heavily tree lined with a nice thick canopy, and the temperature is always 5 to 10 degrees cooler there than it is when you step outside onto St. Andrews Boulevard. And these ecosystem services include protection of our health. There are bacteria and plants and fungus that actually are able to remove toxic and persistent pollutants from the environment and break those down to their component parts, to non-toxic components. So really important that we maintain that biodiversity. So it's contributing to the loss of biodiversity and to extinction. Biggest one, habitat loss. As people move into new and more places and our population expands, we get rid of wild areas to make room for commercial and residential areas. So habitat loss is the number one threat to biodiversity. The introduction of exotic species. We've seen two examples so far, that of the lionfish and that of the shrimp. And so exotic species threaten organisms' biodiversity, organisms in their natural habitat. Pollution reduces the number of organisms present. Overexploitation, using the resource until we exhaust it, leads to extinction, and then disease. So habitat loss, one of the biggest that everyone hears about that's in the news a lot is the loss of the rainforests. So as we lose rainforest, we lose species. A lot of areas of the rainforest have never been studied. We don't even know what species we're losing. Introduced species. Everybody's familiar with kudzu. So our kudzu vine here in the south was introduced to be feed for cattle, and instead they didn't like it. It overgrew everything. It has eliminated a lot of native species. By taking over, we've removed the food source. The plants it's overgrown were the food source for native species that are now gone. Kind of takes over everything. Mongoose. So mongoose were introduced into Hawaii. They were introduced into the Caribbean, throughout the Caribbean, to control rats. Not the best move, since rats are nocturnal hunters. Mongoose hunt during the day. And mongoose, they'll go after rats if they come face to face with them. They'll feed on the young of rats especially. But they also eat snakes, eat birds, they eat a lot of eggs. They eat turtle eggs. So they have had a big adverse impact on sea turtles. They have eliminated snakes, which are natural predators to rats. So in a lot of cases, they've contributed to more of a rat problem by destroying the natural predators to the rats that they were supposed to control. And they've also contributed to the decline of bird species. Islands are particularly sensitive to introduction of exotic species. So the mongoose I talked about. Guam. If anyone has the opportunity to go to Guam, has ever been to Guam, the brown tree snake was introduced to Pacific Islands. In Guam, there are no longer any songbirds, or there are very few songbirds on Guam because the brown tree snake eats bird eggs. Huge push in Hawaii to keep the brown tree snake out so that the same thing doesn't happen there. So pollution, any environmental contaminant that can affect living things, adversely affect living things, can also adversely affect us because we're a living thing. Some of the biggest pollution threats right now are acid deposition, eutrophication, ozone depletion, and synthetic organic chemicals. So acid deposition comes from sulfur dioxides and nitrogen that are present in automobile exhaust, in a lot of industrial pollution, reacts with water in the atmosphere and comes down as acid rain. That can deplete soil of valuable nutrients, making it harder to grow plants. It can weaken trees, make them more susceptible to disease. Can kill invertebrates and decomposers. We're going to look at pH and why reducing pH is such a problem. There are a lot of lakes in the northern U.S. that, because of the change in pH, are now lifeless. And a huge area of study and concern in oceanography right now, in chemical oceanography, is ocean acidification. This is caused by increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which when it's absorbed into the ocean, which the ocean's one of our big carbon sinks, one of the things that is slowing climate change to the extent it is slowed, which we've kind of overwhelmed its capacity now, but the pH of the oceans are changing. We're going to talk about pH in lab. We're going to learn about what buffers are. Buffers prevent changes in pH, and the ocean has one of the most efficient, massive buffering capabilities. For a century, it was thought that humans couldn't possibly change the pH of oceans because of this buffering capacity of the oceans. But lo and behold, in the past 20 years, we have managed to reduce the pH of oceans, which is also leading to other direct economic consequences, because that results in shell-making organisms having a harder time making their calcium carbonate shells. They can't maintain that shell in an acidic environment. So things like oyster shells are becoming thinner and weaker. Think of all the shellfish we eat. So that can have a huge economic impact as well. Eutrophication. Eutrophication is caused by runoff, nutrient-rich runoff. And we think, oh, nutrients, yay, nutrients are good. So what happens is those nutrients feed algae, and we get big, thick algae bloom. The algae are really, really happy. But the algae can cluster on the surface because they're photosynthetic. They want sunlight. They can block sun from lower down, from plants that need it lower down. They can kill seagrasses and other marine plants. But then when these die, they decompose. When things decompose, they use oxygen, and they reduce the oxygen, and you get an anoxic zone in the water body. Remove that oxygen, and aquatic life doesn't do very well when there's no oxygen present. So eutrophication is caused by nutrient runoff, and it ends up in a depletion of oxygen, and then you have big, massive fish die-offs. Ozone depletion, chlorofluorocarbons were main contributor to the decline of that. And when ozone is broken down, harmful UV rays are able to get through the stratosphere. It leads to increase in skin cancer, high increase in cancer rates in areas near the South Pole, like the southern tip of South America, where that ozone hole was directly overhead, and so they were getting more UV rays. That is one of our cases that human intervention was actually able to help and managed to close the ozone hole, or pretty close to close it, when chlorofluorocarbons, when aerosol spray cans were banned. But we still have other products that do that, and so that ozone hole is wavering. Looks like it may start to grow again unless we act again. Organic chemicals, nonylphenols are used in a lot of human products, and they mimic the effects of hormones. So what we see are a lot of cases, things like having organisms whose sex is determined through environmental factors rather than genetics. We see a skewing of the species toward one gender or the other because of the effects of this. We have a lot of these plastics contain some estrogen mimics. These are present in the environment in really high quantities and are possible contributors to earlier onset of puberty in girls and lower testosterone levels in adolescent males and adults. So a lot of these things that enter the environment do come back to us in not always good ways, almost always bad ways. And then climate change, which we had talked about climate change in a previous chapter, in the last chapter. So it's a global phenomenon. It's not evenly distributed. The impacts will be felt more strongly in some areas than others. But again, we get that domino effect. One of the big threats to biodiversity, immediate threats to biodiversity that's going on right now, is coral bleaching and the loss of coral reefs. What happens is the color in corals, all these colors you see here, the coral itself is a calcium carbonate skeleton with a living animal inside of it, with lots of polyps. They're like little tiny anemones, and millions of them living in here. If you think about this as like a condominium, the structure's the condominium, and lots of living organisms live in this condominium. And those living organisms have a symbiotic relationship with some algae that live inside them, and they need each other for both of them to remain healthy. When ocean temperatures rise, the zooxanthellae, those algae that live inside the coral and provide them with nutrients and with oxygen, they leave. And we call this coral bleaching because when those zooxanthellae leave, what's left behind is this white coral skeleton. Coral is not dead yet, but it is much more susceptible to disease, and it struggles a lot more to survive. So it doesn't take a very big rise in temperature to get coral bleaching. And this is happening extensively. About 85% of the reefs in the Caribbean are gone due to bleaching events, and it's heavily impacting Australia's Great Barrier Reef as well. And then overexploitation, that means we just use too much of it. So overfishing is a really big example of that. Overexploitation of fishing resources. We have collapsed many fisheries. There are a lot of fisheries that we have today that actually even 20 years ago, you wouldn't catch those fish. They weren't considered a food source, but because we wiped out the sources that were main food sources, we've had to move on to what had been considered bycatch. Poaching is another use that we exploit, and we overkill the number of organisms till we reduce those populations to the point that they can't come back. Sadly, our axolotl, the example that was posted of one of our cool little salamander with the external gills and the smiley face that everybody wants for an aquarium pet, their population is threatened in part by the aquarium trade. Sadly, because wouldn't we all like to have an aquarium with one of those in it? But that is a big threat to those organisms. And this is just an example of overfishing, trawl fishing. This is the catch that's come up from a drag net. Drag nets are big nets that have a weight on the bottom, and they drag them across the ocean floor to catch fish that are bottom dwellers, like Alaskan pollock. And this is what's left behind. Not a lot. So it's a very high adverse impact fishery. So those are some of the threats to biodiversity, a little bit about why biodiversity is so important. And then you can go ahead and read parts of the chapter of things that are being done: habitat restoration, habitat preservation, restoration of keystone species. We looked at the example of the wolves being reintroduced into Yellowstone. This is some of the interesting efforts that are going on to restore or maintain biodiversity. All right, so that covers it. I will have a review for Chapter 1 tomorrow from noon to 1. If you cannot make that, send me your questions. I will answer them directly to you and also in the recorded review session, and I'll post that review session after we're done. So do come to it prepared with questions.